Content warning. This story contains themes of blood consumption, violence, and mature romantic content. The stranger beside her smelled like old books and winter air, and Fiona Emerson had not meant to fall in love that night. She had climbed down from her observatory perch in the mountains for exactly one evening, because her research partner had threatened to report her to their department head for hermit-like tendencies. The rooftop bar hung over the city like a lantern, all Edison bulbs and exposed brick, fog rolling through the streets below in thick banks that swallowed the traffic lights whole. Fiona nursed a gin and tonic she had not asked for and watched the condensation beat on the glass while around her, conversations rose and fell in waves she could not parse. Small talk had always felt like a foreign language. She understood gravitational lensing and redshift calculations. She did not understand why anyone needed to discuss weather when they could simply look up. The man who sat down beside her at the marble bar top moved with a deliberateness that made her notice. Not the aggressive confidence of men who took up too much space in elevators, but something quieter and more certain. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his frame, and his hair fell white silver to his shoulders in a way that should have looked theatrical, but instead looked inevitable. His skin held the same pale luminescence, as though he had been carved from moonstone and given breath. Fiona found herself staring before she could stop herself. He ordered something in a language she did not recognize, not French or Italian, something older, and the bartender nodded as though this were perfectly normal. When his drink arrived, it looked like wine, but moved too slowly in the glass. "You're wondering if I'm albino," he said, without looking at her, and his voice carried the same old-world weight as his movements. "I'm not." "I wasn't," Fiona lied, then felt immediately foolish. She had spent too long with telescopes and not enough time with people. Her social graces had atrophied. "I was wondering if you were cold. You're very pale." "I run cold." He turned then, and his eyes were the color of garnets held to lamplight, deep red with amber fire in their centers. Not contacts. She knew contacts when she saw them. These were something else entirely. "But I don't mind it." Fiona should have felt afraid. Some primal part of her brain registered those eyes as wrong, as predator, as run. Instead, she felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden realization that she wanted to know what his mouth tasted like. She blamed the gin. She never drank gin. "Do you come here often?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them, and she wanted to sink through the floor. Of all the clichés, that one had to be the worst. But he smiled, actually smiled, warm and genuine, corners of his eyes crinkling, and suddenly the embarrassment mattered less. "Not in decades," he said, "but the view hasn't changed. Still beautiful from up here." He was not looking at the view, he was looking at her. Fiona's brain, usually so reliable, so orderly in its cataloging of data and observations, went briefly and entirely offline. When it came back, she heard herself saying, "Do you believe in love at first sight?" She had meant it as a joke, a deflection, the kind of absurd question you tossed out to break tension when a beautiful stranger looked at you like you were something rare and worth studying. But the moment the words left her mouth, she realized she wanted to know the answer. The man, she still did not know his name, set down his glass with careful precision. The movement felt ceremonial somehow, like he was making space for something important. He turned fully toward her, one elbow on the bar, and regarded her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. "Now I do," he said. The world did not stop. The music kept playing, some jazz quartet in the corner working through a smoky rendition of a song she almost recognized. Conversations continued around them in their pleasant buzz. The fog outside rolled on, indifferent to declarations made in rooftop bars by strangers with impossible eyes. But something in Fiona's chest cracked open anyway. Something she had not known was closed, and she felt the truth of it like a physical thing. She was in love with him. Completely, irrationally, catastrophically in love with a man whose name she did not know, who drank strange wine and spoke dead languages and looked at her like she was the only person in the world worth seeing. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice shook. "Most things worth having are." He extended his hand, palm up, an invitation. "Ravian Valdis." She took it, His skin was cool against hers, smooth as marble, and when their palms touched, she felt a shock run up her arm that had nothing to do with static. Fiona Emerson. Astronomer, he said, not a question. How did you know? Your hands. He turned her palm gently, tracing the calluses at the base of her fingers. Equipment work, precise movements, and you've been looking at the sky every 30 seconds since I sat down, checking cloud cover. You're used to tracking celestial motion. Fiona's laugh surprised her, bright and genuine. And what are you? A detective? Something like that. His thumb brushed over her wrist, right where her pulse hammered. His expression shifted, became more focused. Your heart is racing. I know. Are you afraid? She should be. Every rational instinct said so, but rationality had abandoned her the moment he set down his glass, and what remained was only the wild, reckless certainty that she would follow this man anywhere he asked her to go. No, she said. Should I be? Ravian studied her for a long moment, and something in his face went soft, almost sad. Probably, but I find I don't want you to be. They talked until the bar closed, or rather, Fiona talked and Ravian listened with the kind of attention she had only ever gotten from research colleagues mid-debate. She told him about her work tracking exoplanets, about the telescope array in the mountains where she spent her nights mapping distant solar systems. She told him about growing up in Seattle with rain-soaked skies that made stargazing impossible, about her father who bought her first telescope when she was 8, about the summer she saw Saturn's rings for the first time and decided the entire universe was worth understanding. Ravian told her less, but what he did say mattered more. He had been alone for a long time, he said. He had lived in the city before it was a city, when it was still a trading post huddled against the river. He collected old manuscripts that explained the book smell and spent his time preserving things that would otherwise be lost. When Fiona asked why, he said simply that someone had to remember. Remember what? She asked. Everything. Everyone. All the small moments that make up a life. They deserve to be kept. The bartender called last round. Ravian paid for both their drinks with cash from a silver clip, old bills that looked freshly minted despite their dates. They walked down the stairs together, out into the street where the fog had thickened to soup. Fiona's apartment was 6 blocks north. Her car was in a garage another 3 blocks west. She should have said goodnight, should have walked away, gone home, woken up the next morning, and convinced herself this had been a lovely aberration, a story to tell over coffee when her colleagues asked how her night out went. Instead, she said, I don't want this to end. Ravian stopped walking. They stood beneath a street lamp that turned the fog into a golden halo, and he looked at her with such naked longing that her breath caught. Neither do I, he said. But Fiona, there are things you need to know about what I am, about what this... He gestured between them at the invisible cord that had been pulling tighter all night. Would mean. Tell me. She stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the chill radiating off him, could see the exact shade of crimson in his eyes. Whatever it is, tell me. Not here. He glanced around at the empty street, the shuttered shops, the buildings that loomed like sentinels in the mist. Come with me. Let me show you. She should have said no, should have demanded explanations here, in public, in the relative safety of street lamps and potential witnesses. But when he offered his hand, she took it, and when he led her down a side street into an alley she had never noticed before, she followed. The entrance appeared only when Ravian touched the brick wall, pressing his palm flat against what looked like solid stone. Reality rippled like water, and suddenly there was a door, iron-banded oak that belonged in a castle, not a city alley. He pushed it open and gestured for her to enter first. Beyond the door lay a staircase spiraling down, lit by sconces that burned with flameless light. The walls were older than anything Fiona had seen above ground, massive stones fit together without mortar, each one carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air smelled like incense, and copper, and time. This isn't possible, Fiona said, but she was already descending, one hand trailing along the cold stone. You're a scientist, Ravian said from behind her, his footsteps silent on the stairs. You know better than most that impossible just means we haven't found the explanation yet. The stairs ended in a hall that stretched longer than the city block above it should have allowed. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow overhead. More of those flameless lights burned in alcoves, illuminating tapestries that depicted battles in courts and creatures Fiona had no names for. At the far end stood a pair of doors 3 times her height, their surfaces etched with what might have been a family tree or a star chart, she could not tell which. Ravian walked past her and pushed the doors open with both hands. Beyond lay a throne room. Not a metaphorical throne room, not some rich person's idea of dramatic decor. An actual throne room, stone and vaulted wood and stained glass windows that showed a sky that was not the sky outside. The throne itself sat on a raised dais at the far end, carved from a single piece of black stone that reflected the light like obsidian. Around the walls stood others like Ravian, pale-skinned, pale-haired, eyes in shades of red and amber and blood-dark garnet. They watched Fiona enter with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "This is my court," Ravian said quietly. "These are my people. We are what humans call vampires, though we prefer the old name. Sanguis noctis, blood of the night." Fiona's legs felt suddenly unsteady. She reached for the nearest pillar, pressed her back against it, tried to make her scientist's brain process what her eyes were seeing. Vampires, real, actual vampires. The data did not compute, but the evidence stood before her undeniable. "You drink blood," she heard herself say. "Yes. You don't age." "No." "Sunlight?" "Burns." "Not instantly, but we avoid it when we can." "Stakes through the heart?" "Would kill us, but so would a stake through the heart of anyone." A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "We're difficult to kill, not invulnerable." Fiona processed this, filing each piece of information away in the mental folders where she kept things that redefined her understanding of reality. She had done this before, the first time she understood cosmic inflation, the first time she calculated the curvature of space-time. The universe was strange and vast and full of things that seemed impossible until you looked at them properly. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Ravian crossed the space between them, moving with that same deliberate grace. He stopped just beyond arm's reach, respecting the distance she needed. "Because you asked if I believed in love at first sight. Because when I said, 'Now I do,' I meant it. Because in 900 years of living I have never felt what I felt sitting beside you in that bar, and I will not start this, whatever this is, with lies." 900 years. The number rattled around Fiona's skull, too large to properly grasp. He had been alive when her 24th great-grandparents were born. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had lived through plagues and wars and the entire bloody span of recorded history, and he was standing here in front of her saying he loved her. "I don't know what to do with that," Fiona said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "You don't have to do anything with it, not yet." Ravian's hand lifted slightly, aborted halfway to reaching for her. "I brought you here because I wanted you to see the truth, all of it. If you want to leave, if this is too much, I will have someone escort you home, and you will never see me again. Your memory of this will feel like a dream by morning. We have ways." "You can alter memories?" "When we have to. For protection, ours and yours." Fiona looked past him at the assembled court, at the impossible throne room carved beneath an impossible city, at the windows showing impossible skies. She thought about her telescope pointed at the heavens, about all the distant worlds she had catalogued and studied and never touched. She thought about spending her life observing from a distance, safe and alone in her mountain observatory, or stepping into the unknown with both feet and seeing what happened. "No," she said. Ravian's expression shuddered. "I understand. Let me—" "No, I mean I don't want to leave." She pushed off from the pillar, closed the distance between them, and took his cool hand in both of hers. "I want to stay. I want to know everything. I want—" her voice cracked. "I want you." The throne room had been silent before. Now it became the kind of silence that had weight, that pressed against eardrums and made the air feel thick, every pair of red eyes fixed on them, and Fiona realized they were witnessing something significant. Ravian's hand tightened around hers. "There's something else," he said, and now his voice carried an edge of pain. "Something that makes this more complicated than you know." "Tell me." He looked at the assembled court, then back at her. "Not here. Come." He led her through a side door. down another corridor, into a chamber that might have been a study or a library or both. Books lined every wall, floor to ceiling, and in the center sat a desk of dark wood covered in manuscripts. Ravian gestured to a chair upholstered in burgundy velvet, waited until she sat, then lowered himself into the chair across from her. 400 years ago, he began, my bloodline was cursed. Fiona listened as he spoke. The story came out haltingly, as though each word cost him something. His ancestor, a king named Valdis the Conqueror, had led their people through a war that nearly destroyed them. Thousands died vampire and human, both. When the bloodshed finally ended and Valdis surveyed the ruin, grief drove him mad with guilt. He became convinced that his nature, his hunger, his violence, his vampiric essence was a sickness that spread through his blood to every child born of his line. So Valdis swore an oath, a blood oath, binding on every level of magic and soul. No descendant of his line would take a lover or bear children. The bloodline would end with his living heirs, and the curse would die with them. Except there was no curse, Ravian said, leaning back in his chair and pressing his palms against his eyes. Not really. Valdis was a conqueror, yes, violent and ambitious and hungry for power, but that was choice, not compulsion, not inherited madness. He could have stopped at any time. He didn't want to. After the war ended and he saw what he'd done, he couldn't live with that truth, so he invented a curse to explain it away. Blamed his blood instead of his choices. But the oath is still binding, Fiona said. Yes, sworn in the old way with witnesses and ritual and blood. It cannot be broken without consequence. Anyone who tries to violate it, who takes a lover, who seeks to have children, the oath activates. They die, slowly and painfully from the inside out. Has anyone tried? 3. Over 4 centuries. All 3 are dead. Fiona's hands felt cold. She tucked them under her thighs and tried to think. So you're telling me you're in love with me, but you can never act on it, never be with me in any real way. Yes. The word came out like broken glass. I'm telling you that I sat beside you tonight and felt something I swore I would never feel, and now I am trapped between wanting you more than I have ever wanted anything and knowing that acting on it will kill me. She should have been angry, should have felt betrayed or manipulated or used. Instead, she felt only a crushing sadness for this man, this vampire, this king who had been carrying this weight for centuries and had finally found something worth breaking under. What do you want me to say? She asked. I don't know. Ravian dropped his hands and looked at her, and his eyes were so old and so lost. I brought you here because I needed you to know the truth, because the alternative was lying to you or using magic to make you forget, and both of those felt worse than this. I'm sorry. I should not have spoken to you at all, should have walked away the moment I realized what was happening. But I'm selfish, and I wanted— He stopped, shook his head. It doesn't matter what I wanted. Fiona stood, crossed to his chair, knelt in front of him and took his face in both hands, feeling the cool, smooth skin against her palms, the sharp line of his jaw. It matters, she said. Tell me what you wanted. One night, he said, and his voice broke. Just one night where I wasn't alone, where someone looked at me and saw more than a king or a monster or a relic. You looked at me like I was just a man. I wanted to keep that for as long as I could. She kissed him. It was not a wise choice. Not strategic or careful or remotely rational. But Fiona had spent her whole life being rational, making wise choices, playing it safe and studying the stars from a distance. And where had it gotten her? Alone in an observatory, brilliant and isolated, and so lonely. Ravian froze against her, then made a sound low in his throat and kissed her back. His hands came up to cup her face with devastating gentleness, like she was something precious and breakable. He tasted like copper and wine and winter nights, and when he pulled back they were both breathing hard. Fiona, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. We can't. I know. The oath. I know. She pressed her forehead against his, closed her eyes, let herself have this moment, even though it was probably all they would ever get. But I'm a scientist, Ravian. I solve impossible problems for a living. Let me try to solve this one. She felt him tense. There's no solution. Believe me, we've looked. Scholars, mages, researchers, everyone who could possibly find a way around the oath has tried. Did any of them have access to a research astronomer with a stubborn streak and a pathological need to prove people wrong? She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Let me try. Show me everything, every record, every text, every piece of evidence about this curse and this oath. Let me look at it with fresh eyes. And if you find nothing? Then they would deal with that when it came. But Fiona did not say that. Instead, she said, I found an exoplanet last year that everyone swore didn't exist. The orbital mechanics were supposedly impossible. I proved them wrong. Maybe I can do it again. For the first time since they entered the study, something like hope flickered across Ravian's face. It was fragile and tentative, the hope of someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust it fully, but it was there. I will show you everything, he said. But dawn is coming. You should rest. Fiona glanced around the windowless study. What time is it? Nearly 5. The sun rises at 6:15. He stood, offered her his hand. There are rooms here, guest quarters. You'll be safe and comfortable. Where will you be? My chambers are deeper underground, away from any potential sunlight. He paused. I would like to stay with you, just to be near you, if that's acceptable. Acceptable. As though she had not just upended her entire understanding of reality for him, as though she would not have walked into the sun herself if he asked. Fiona felt a laugh bubble up, slightly hysterical. Yes, she said, that's acceptable. The guest quarters turned out to be a suite of rooms more luxurious than any hotel Fiona had ever seen. A bedroom with a 4-poster bed hung in midnight blue silk, a bathroom with a tub carved from a single piece of marble, a sitting area with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace that lit itself when they entered. Ravian showed her where everything was, then hesitated at the door. I'll be just outside, he said. If you need anything, and stay. The word came out before she could second-guess it. Please, I don't want to be alone right now. He stayed. They did not kiss again. That felt too dangerous, too much like standing at the edge of a cliff and leaning forward to see what falling felt like. Instead, they lay on top of the covers, full-dressed, side by side in the dark, their hands linked between them. Fiona talked about constellations and gravitational waves and the sound the universe made in its infancy. Ravian talked about manuscripts he had saved and languages that no living humans spoke and the way cities smelled different before cars and industry. Somewhere in the middle of a story about a comet she had tracked for 3 months, Fiona fell asleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and the disorienting realization that she was underground in a vampire court because she had fallen in love with a dead man. Except Ravian was not dead. He sat in one of the armchairs by the fireplace, reading a book so old the pages looked like they might crumble at a touch. And when he noticed her stirring, he smiled. There's breakfast, he said, gesturing to a table that had not been there when she fell asleep. One of my people brought it down. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I had them bring options. Options turned out to be an understatement. Pastries and fruit and eggs and bacon and 3 different kinds of bread and a carafe of coffee that smelled like heaven. Fiona's stomach reminded her that she had not eaten since lunch the previous day. She filled a plate and ate while Ravian watched with the quiet contentment of someone who had forgotten what food tasted like but remembered the pleasure of watching someone else enjoy it. Do you miss it? She asked around a bite of croissant. Eating? Sometimes. I remember the taste of strawberries, fresh bread. My mother made this soup with lamb and rosemary. He shook his head. But blood sustains us better than food ever did. It's a fair trade. Where do you get it? The blood? Volunteers mostly, humans who know what we are and choose to donate. We compensate them well. Some of my people still hunt, but that's rarer now, harder to hide in a world with security cameras and forensics. Fiona filed this information away with everything else she was learning to accept. Vampires, blood drinking, underground courts. Her life had become a gothic novel overnight, and the strangest part was how much sense it made once she stopped fighting it. Show me the records, she said. Everything about the curse and the oath. Ravian set down his book and stood. Follow me. They spent the next 3 days in what Ravian called the archive. It was a vast circular room buried so deep underground that Fiona lost count of the staircases on the way down. The walls were lined with shelves that held everything from clay tablets to leather-bound codices to filing boxes full of loose papers. In the center sat a reading table with a dozen chairs and lamps that adjusted their brightness automatically. Everything smelled like old paper and preservation magic. Ravian brought her manuscripts in languages she could not read and translated them aloud, his voice steady and patient as he worked through texts written by his ancestors. Fiona took notes in a spiral-bound notebook she had found in her bag. Thank God she always carried one, and began constructing a timeline. The curse supposedly began with Valdis, but the symptoms were vague. Violent tendencies, hunger that could not be sated, an inability to feel remorse. When Fiona pressed for specifics, for documented cases or medical evidence, the sources had nothing concrete. Just descriptions that sounded more like personality disorders than supernatural affliction. "This isn't a curse," she said on the third day, looking up from a text that detailed the oath's creation. "This is just a man having a mental breakdown and convincing everyone around him it was something mystical." Ravian sat across from her, another manuscript open in front of him. "That's what I've suspected for years. But suspecting and proving are different things." "Then we prove it." Fiona flipped to a fresh page in her notebook. "The oath is bound to the belief in the curse, right? That's what your people said. Valdis swore his bloodline would end because it was cursed. So if we can prove there was never a curse, the logical foundation for the oath collapses." "Magic doesn't work on logic." "Everything works on logic. Magic just has rules we don't fully understand yet." She tapped her pen against the paper, thinking. What would it take to dissolve the oath? A unanimous vote from the council, or proof that the oath was sworn under false pretenses. Ravian's eyes narrowed. "You think we can argue false pretenses?" "I think we can argue that Valdis believed something untrue and bound his entire bloodline to a lie. If the curse never existed, the oath is based on a delusion. That has to count for something." They worked through the night. Ravian sent for more records, older texts, medical histories of every Valdis descendant born before the oath. Fiona built her case like she would build a research paper, citation by citation, piece of evidence stacked on piece of evidence. The curse had no consistent symptoms, no pattern of inheritance. The 3 vampires who died after violating the oath had died from the oath's magic itself, not from any underlying condition. By the time dawn approached again, Fiona had 20 pages of notes and the bones of an argument that might actually work. "We need to present this to the council," she said, setting down her pen and flexing her cramped fingers. "Can you call them?" "I can, but Fiona," Ravian reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "If this doesn't work, if they reject the argument, the oath stands. We'll have one chance at this. Then we'll make it count." She turned her hand over, threaded her fingers through his. "I'm not ready to give up on us yet." The council convened the next evening. 7 vampires, each representing a different bloodline within the Sanguis Noctis, sat in high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle. Ravian sat at the center on what Fiona now recognized as the king's seat, and she stood beside him, holding her notebook like a shield. The council members watched her with expressions ranging from skeptical to hostile. She was human. She was an outsider, and she was asking them to overturn 4 centuries of tradition. She presented her findings anyway. Walk them through the timeline, the lack of evidence, the inconsistencies in Valdis's account. She talked about confirmation bias and the way trauma could distort memory, about how guilt sometimes needed a scapegoat, even if that scapegoat was yourself. She showed them records that proved Valdis's children and grandchildren lived normal lives, or as normal as vampire lives could be, with no sign of inherited madness or violence beyond the baseline that came with being apex predators. The curse, she concluded, never existed. It was a story Valdis told himself to make sense of his choices, and by binding the oath to that story, he locked all of you into living his delusion. You've sacrificed 400 years of love and family and life because a grieving king couldn't face the truth about himself. Silence fell over the chamber. Fiona's heart hammered against her ribs. She had laid everything out as clearly as she could, given them every piece of evidence, made the case airtight. Now all she could do was wait. The vampire to Ravian's left spoke first. Her name was Celeste, and she had been alive when the oath was sworn. "I was there that night," she said slowly. "I watched Valdis cut his palm and swear on his blood and his soul. He believed every word. We all did." "Belief doesn't make something true," Fiona said. "The earth seemed flat for thousands of years. People believed it with everything they had. They were still wrong. This is different. Is it? Or is it just harder to admit you've been wrong for longer?" Another council member, a man named Soren with scars running down one side of his face, leaned forward. "The oath has already killed 3 of our people. Even if the curse is false, the oath itself is real. Breaking it will kill Ravian." "Not if you dissolve it first," Fiona said. "That's why we're here. Ravian told me the council has the authority to release someone from an oath if it was sworn under false pretenses. This qualifies. Valdis built the entire thing on a foundation that doesn't exist." "The human makes a compelling argument," said a third vampire, younger looking than the others, but no less ancient. "I have never seen evidence of any inherited curse, only stories, legends, the kind of thing we tell ourselves to make tragedy feel purposeful." The debate stretched on for hours. Fiona's legs ached from standing, but she refused to sit, refused to show any weakness while they discussed the validity of her research like it was an academic exercise and not a matter of life and love and everything that mattered. Ravian remained silent through most of it, his face carefully neutral, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. Finally, Celeste stood. "I call for a vote. All those in favor of releasing Ravian Valdis from the blood oath sworn by his ancestor, on the grounds that said oath was based on false belief and has no legitimate foundation, say aye." 6 voices said aye. The 7th hesitated, then nodded. Aye. Unanimous. Fiona felt her knees go weak. Ravian caught her before she could fall, his arm around her waist, his face buried in her hair. She heard him whisper something in that old language he had used at the bar, words she did not understand but felt in her bones. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Celeste approached them with something in her hands, a rolled parchment tied with a silk cord. "The original oath," she said, "kept in our deepest vault for 400 years. It's yours now to do with as you wish." Ravian took it with shaking hands. The parchment crackled when he unrolled it, brown with age, covered in script that looked like it had been written in blood. Because it had, Fiona realized. Valdis's blood, used as ink to bind his words into magic. "Burn it," she said. "Let's burn it tonight." They carried the oath up to the surface, not to the rooftop bar where they had met that felt too public, too exposed, but to Fiona's observatory in the mountains. She called her research partner and invented a family emergency, said she would be back when she could, then drove Ravian up the winding roads as dawn broke behind them. He sat in the passenger seat wrapped in a heavy cloak with a hood, flinching at every ray of light that filtered through the trees. The observatory sat on a plateau that overlooked the valley, a white dome surrounded by evergreens. Fiona unlocked the door and led Ravian inside, into the dim coolness where her telescope waited like a sleeping giant. She had spent so many nights here alone, mapping distant worlds and telling herself she was content with the solitude. Now she could barely remember what that loneliness had felt like. They waited for nightfall. Fiona showed Ravian how the telescope worked, let him look through the eyepiece at Jupiter's moons and Saturn's rings in the Andromeda galaxy. He stared for a long time at that distant spiral of stars, 2.5 million light-years away, and when he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet. "All that distance," he said, "all that time, light from before humans existed, just now reaching us, and we're here to see it." "We're here," Fiona agreed, and took his hand. When full dark came, they went outside. The stars spread overhead in a thick river of light, the Milky Way so bright this far from the city that it cast faint shadows. A meteor shower was due Perseids, her favorite, and already she could see streaks of light beginning to trace paths across the sky. Ravian unrolled the oath one last time. Fiona produced a lighter from her pocket, the kind she used to light the Bunsen burner in the observatory's small lab. She flicked it on and held the flame to the parchment's edge. The oath caught fire immediately, burning with a light that was not quite natural, edges curling inward as 400 years of binding magic released its hold. The smoke smelled like copper and old grief. They stood together and watched it burn down to ash, and when the last ember died, Ravian turned to Fiona and kissed her like she was air and he was drowning. Different from their first kiss. Desperate where that one had been gentle, raw where that one had been sweet. His hands tangled in her hair and her arms wrapped around his neck, and they held each other in the starlight while meteors fell overhead like benedictions. "I love you," Ravian said against her mouth. "I love you. I will love you until the stars burn out." "That's a long time," Fiona said, breathless. "Not long enough." They stayed at the observatory for 3 days. Ravian slept in the basement storage room during daylight hours, wrapped in blankets in a space with no windows, and joined Fiona at night when she worked. She taught him how to calibrate the telescope and read star charts. He taught her phrases in languages that had been dead for millennia and told her stories about civilizations that history had forgotten. They mapped the sky together, two lonely creatures who had found each other by accident and decided to build something permanent. On the 4th night, Ravian asked, "What happens now?" They sat on the observatory's roof, Fiona's favorite spot for watching meteor showers, sharing a thermos of coffee that only Fiona drank. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "What do you mean?" Fiona asked, though she knew. "I'm a vampire. You're human. I will live another 1,000 years if nothing kills me, and you will have maybe 60 more if you're lucky." His voice stayed steady, but she could hear the pain underneath. "I don't know how to do this. How to love you knowing I'll lose you." Fiona had been thinking about this since the night they met, had been running calculations in her head the way she always did when faced with a problem that seemed impossible. She took a sip of coffee, set the thermos down, and turned to face him fully. "You're thinking about it wrong," she said. "You're looking at the end point and working backward. Don't do that. Look at where we are now and work forward. We have tonight. We'll probably have tomorrow. If we're very lucky, we'll have decades. That's more than a lot of people get." "It's not enough." "It never is. That's what makes it precious." She took his hand, cool and steady in hers. "My dad died when I was 23. Brain aneurysm. No warning. Just there one day and gone the next. I spent years angry that we didn't have more time. Then I realized I was so busy mourning what we didn't have that I forgot to be grateful for what we did. 23 years with him. That's 23 years more than nothing. That's different." "Why? Because you're immortal?" Fiona shook her head. "You told me you've been alone for 900 years. How much of that time was actually living and how much was just existing? I'd rather have 50 real years with you than 900 years of going through the motions." Ravian was quiet for a long moment. Overhead, another meteor traced its bright path and vanished. Finally, he said, "There might be a way." Fiona's heart kicked. "A way to what?" "To extend your life. Not immortality that requires being turned, requires dying and rising again, and it doesn't always work. But there are old magics, blood bonds. If you regularly took small amounts of my blood, it would slow your aging, not stop it. You'd still grow old eventually, but decades would become centuries. You'd have time." "How much time?" "I don't know. It varies. But if we started soon, while you're still young." He turned to look at her fully, hope and fear warring in his expression. "You could have 300 years, maybe more. It wouldn't make you vampire, but it would give us time." 300 years. Fiona tried to wrap her mind around it and couldn't quite manage. That was longer than telescopes had existed, longer than the United States had been a country, long enough to see technologies rise and fall, to watch the stars shift in their slow cosmic dance, to map every corner of the galaxy if she wanted to, long enough to love this man the way he deserved to be loved. "What's the catch?" she asked, because there was always a catch. "You'd be bound to me. Blood bonds are permanent. You wouldn't age as long as the bond held, but if I died, you'd start aging normally again. And there are side effects. Enhanced senses, strength. You'd be somewhere between human and vampire, not quite either. Would I need to drink blood? No. The magic sustains itself once established, but you might find you're more sensitive to sunlight, that you prefer the dark. Your sleep schedule would probably shift to match mine." Fiona thought about her life, her observatory, her research, the careful routines she had built around a solitary existence. Then she thought about waking up every evening next to Ravian, about having centuries to explore the universe together, about never having to choose between her work and the person she loved because they could make room for both. "Yes," she said, "I want that. I want all the time with you I can have." The bond was created that night in the observatory under the meteor shower. Ravian made a small cut on his wrist with a blade he produced from somewhere, and Fiona drank 3 mouthfuls of blood that tasted like copper and lightning and forever. The magic took hold immediately. She felt it racing through her veins like fire, rewriting something fundamental in her cells. And when it was done, she looked up at the stars and saw them clearer than she ever had before. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, wow." "What do you see?" Ravian asked, his hand pressed against the cut that was already healing. "Everything. The colors there are colors I didn't know existed. And I can see the Andromeda Galaxy without the telescope. I can see it clear as day." She turned to him, wonder bright in her chest. "Is this how you always see the world?" "Yes. Welcome to the night." They went back down to the city eventually. Fiona arranged a sabbatical from her university position, claimed she needed time for a special research project, which was technically true, and moved her essential equipment into the underground court. Ravian had a room cleared out and converted into a laboratory where she could continue her work. It was better than the university setup, actually. No budget constraints. Access to technologies that had not been invented yet, but that the vampires had somehow acquired anyway. Research assistants from immortals who remembered ancient astronomy and could help her correlate modern data with observations made centuries before telescopes existed. She published 3 papers in the first year. Would have published more, but she kept getting distracted by Ravian, by the court, by the sheer impossible wonder of the life she was building. They traveled. Ravian showed her places he had lived across the centuries, crumbling castles in Eastern Europe where he had spent decades hiding from vampire hunters, libraries in Alexandria that predated the famous burning, mountain monasteries where monks had let him stay in exchange for protection. Fiona showed him the modern world through her eyes, particle accelerators and space stations and deep-sea submersibles, all the ways humanity had learned to explore the universe despite their brief lives. They argued sometimes. Fiona had opinions about Ravian's tendency to brood and his occasional high-handed king behavior. Ravian had opinions about Fiona's habit of staying awake 3 days straight when she was onto something interesting and her complete inability to remember to eat regularly. But they always came back to each other, always found the center again, because underneath everything else was the fundamental truth that they had chosen each other deliberately and would keep choosing each other every day. 5 years after they met, Ravian asked her to marry him, not with a ring that felt too modern, too impersonal, but with a circlet of silver set with a stone that held a piece of meteorite iron. "A fragment of the sky," he said, slipping it onto her head, "for the woman who taught me to look up again." They married in the court with both their families present, Fiona's mother and 2 brothers who she had finally told the truth to about vampires, and Ravian's court who had become something like family over the years. Celeste officiated, speaking the old vows in a language Fiona was learning slowly, and when she pronounced them bound, Fiona kissed her husband and felt the words settle into her bones like bedrock. Husband, partner, forever. 10 years after that, they started talking about children. "The oath is broken," Fiona said one evening. They sat in their private chambers, her workstation cluttered with papers and his with manuscripts, existing in comfortable parallel silence the way they did most nights. "There's nothing stopping you from having a family now." Ravian set down the text he had been translating and looked at her carefully. "Do you want that? A child?" "I think so, eventually." She fiddled with her pen, nervous suddenly. "Do you?" "I spent 400 years believing I would never have the option. Now that I do." He crossed to her chair, knelt beside it, took her restless hands in his. "Yes, I want that. With you. If you want it too." They tried for 3 years. Fiona tracked her cycles and took hormones and did everything the human doctors suggested, but nothing worked. Finally, she went to the vampire healers, the ones who understood blood magic and mixed biology, and they explained what she had already started to suspect. The blood bond made her something between human and vampire, and that in-between state made conception difficult, not impossible, but rare. Some bonds lasted centuries before producing children. Some never did. "We could stop trying," Ravian said when she told him. "If this is hurting you, no, I want to keep trying. I just needed to know it wasn't something I was doing wrong." So they kept trying. Lived their lives, loved each other, watched the world change around them as Fiona's 50-year mark approached, and her appearance barely changed. She looked perhaps 30 now instead of 26, aging at roughly a tenth the normal speed. Her mother had passed and her brothers were entering middle age, while Fiona remained frozen in young adulthood. It was strange and sad, and also a gift because she got to watch her nephews and nieces grow up, got to be the cool aunt who told them wild stories and taught them about stars. And then, 63 years after that night in the rooftop bar, Fiona realized she had missed her cycle. The vampire healer confirmed it 2 weeks later. Pregnant. Against all odds and statistical probability, pregnant. "It's the bond finally settling," the healer explained. "Took longer than most, but that happens sometimes. Your body finally accepted the magic fully. Decided you were safe enough, settled enough, to carry a child." Fiona told Ravian that night in their chambers. He had been reading, relaxed in an armchair, with a glass of blood wine, and when she said the words, he went very still. "You're certain?" he asked. The healer confirmed it. "We're having a baby." The glass slipped from his hand. He caught it just before it hit the floor, vampire reflexes saving them from a mess, and then he was across the room pulling her into his arms. He held her carefully, like she might break, and she felt him shaking against her. 400 years, he said into her hair. 400 years he for staying. Thank you for being stubborn enough to break a curse that didn't exist. She laughed, tears streaming down her face, and pulled back enough to kiss him. "You're welcome. Now let's figure out how to be parents." Pregnancy as a blood-bonded human turned out to be complicated. Fiona craved red meat and iron and, occasionally, small amounts of blood that Ravian provided without question. Her enhanced senses grew more acute, to the point where she could hear conversations happening 3 rooms away. She stopped aging entirely while pregnant. The healer said the baby was drawing on the bond magic, using it to develop properly, and emerged from the pregnancy looking exactly as she had when she conceived. Labor lasted 14 hours and hurt like nothing Fiona had ever experienced. She broke Ravian's hand, holding on during contractions, broke it, actually shattered bones. He had to get it healed magically afterward and screamed in 3 languages, including one she did not remember learning. But at the end of it, she held a tiny, perfect baby boy who opened his eyes and looked at her with irises that were just barely tinged red around the edges. "He has your eyes," Ravian said, his voice full of wonder, "and your hair. He looks human." "He is human, mostly." The healer had explained this too. Blood-bonded parents produced human children with slight vampire traits, enhanced healing, longer lifespans, sensitivity to sunlight, not vampire, but not entirely human either. "He's ours. That's what matters." They named him Neval, an old name from Ravian's language that meant new dawn. He grew faster than human children, but slower than vampire ones, walking at 8 months and talking at a year. He was curious and fearless and absolutely exhausting, with his mother's stubborn streak and his father's dramatic tendencies. Fiona loved him so completely it terrified her. Neval was 3 when he discovered the observatory. Fiona had been showing him stars from the court, using illusion magic to project the night sky on the ceiling of his nursery. But it was not the same. So one clear night, she and Ravian wrapped him in blankets and drove up to the mountain, to the place where everything had started. The telescope still sat in its dome, maintained by automated systems Fiona had set up decades before. She lifted Neval up to the eyepiece. He was just barely tall enough and adjusted the focus until Saturn swam into view. "Look," she said. "See the rings?" Neval gasped. "Pretty. Can we go there?" "Not yet. Maybe someday when you're older." She glanced at Ravian, who stood in the doorway watching them with an expression of such profound contentment that her heart ached. "Want to see, Papa?" He crossed to them, looked through the eyepiece for the 100th time, and smiled. "Still beautiful, just like the first time you showed me." They stayed at the observatory until dawn approached, Neval falling asleep against Fiona's shoulder, while she and Ravian watched the meteor shower overhead. the same shower that had been falling the night they burned the oath, the night they chose each other permanently. It came around every year like clockwork, predictable and eternal, the universe's way of reminding them that some things were meant to be. "Do you ever regret it?" Fiona asked quietly. "Taking the chance on me that night?" Ravian pulled his gaze from the sky to look at her, at their sleeping son, at the life they had built against all probability. "Never," he said, "not for a single moment. You asked me if I believed in love at first sight. I didn't. Not until I met you. Now I believe in all of it, in fate and chance and impossible solutions, and love that breaks curses that never existed. I believe in us." "Good," Fiona said, and kissed him while meteors fell overhead and their son dreamed in her arms. "So do I." They went back down to the city as the sun rose, Ravian wrapped in his cloak and Fiona driving with one hand so she could hold his with the other. The court waited below, their home carved out of stone and time and magic. Fiona's lab waited with half-finished research into gravitational waves and dark matter. Ravian's study waited with manuscripts to preserve and histories to record. A life waited, full and rich and longer than Fiona had ever imagined she would have. She had come to that rooftop bar 63 years ago expecting one forgettable evening. Instead, she had found forever. Neval stirred in his car seat as they descended into the underground garage. "Home," he mumbled, still half asleep. "Home," Fiona confirmed, and carried him inside while Ravian kept one hand on her back, protective and gentle and absolutely certain. They walked through the halls together, past the tapestries and the sconces and the throne room where it had all become real, past the archives where Fiona had built her case one citation at a time, past the guest quarters where they had spent that first strange morning figuring out how to be in love with someone impossible, into their chambers where they put Neval in his bed and tucked him in with his favorite blanket, where they stood together watching him sleep, this miracle they had made against all odds. "I would do it again," Ravian said softly. "Every choice, every risk, every moment of fear that I might lose you. I would do all of it again to end up here." "Me too," Fiona said, and meant it with every cell of her blood bonded, longer than human, absolutely impossible and completely real body. They turned out the lights and went to their own bed, curling together in the darkness beneath the city, beneath the world, in the space they had carved out for love to exist when logic said it should not. And they slept, the vampire king and his astronomer, while above them the stars wheeled on in their ancient dance and the universe expanded exactly as it always had, full of mysteries and wonders and endless possibilities for those brave enough to look up and believe.